The sun had just begun to rise, and a soft orange light spread across the quiet streets. The sound of a few early birds mixed with the distant hum of buses starting their routes. At the old factory gate, a man in his late 50s adjusted his faded uniform cap and took a deep breath before stepping into his small guard booth. His name was Mr. Harris, though most people simply called him the Old Guard. He had been standing at that same gate for more than 25 years. Every morning, no matter the weather, he arrived before anyone else. He would sweep the little area around his post, check the lock on the main gate, and polish the brass nameplate that had long lost its shine. It wasn't part of his duty to do all that, but it made him feel right. Order gave him peace, and routine was something he could count on when everything else in life was uncertain. His co-workers always said he was the calmest man they knew. Nothing ever seemed to bother him. If someone came late, he'd remind them with a quiet smile. If a delivery truck driver lost his temper over the long wait, Mr. Harris would patiently explain the process until the man calmed down. He didn't shout, didn't argue, and never showed anger. People trusted him. They said he had the kind of patience that only time and experience could teach. But that morning, something felt different. He had barely slept the night before. The roof of his small apartment had leaked during the rain, soaking part of his bed. His joints ached, and the cheap medicine he took wasn't helping much. On top of that, the landlord had reminded him that the rent was late again. He was embarrassed to admit it, but his savings were running out. His youngest daughter was still in college, and most of his earnings went there. He never complained, but the weight of these worries showed in the way his shoulders slumped and how often he rubbed his tired eyes. Still, when the factory clock struck 6, he stood straight, buttoned his uniform jacket properly, and opened the main gate like he did every morning. The workers began arriving one by one, greeting him with the same routine nods and friendly, "Good morning, Mr. Harris." He replied with his usual calm tone, "Morning, folks. Have a good shift." He always believed that no matter how bad a night was, the day ahead deserved a clean start, and for the first few hours it seemed like any other ordinary day. He checked identification cards, noted vehicle numbers, and kept track of entries in his logbook with neat handwriting. The sound of machines starting up inside the factory became the steady rhythm of his day. He liked that rhythm. It made him feel part of something constant, something that didn't change. Around 8 o'clock, a small delivery van pulled up. The driver jumped out, chewing gum, and handed over his papers with one hand, while talking loudly on his phone with the other. Mr. Harris waited patiently, holding the papers without interrupting. When the man finally noticed him, he quickly hung up and apologized. "Sorry, sir, long morning already," he said. Mr. Harris smiled faintly and replied, "No rush, just follow the process. We'll get you through." The driver nodded and left, and for a brief moment Harris felt proud. This small act of calmness, this simple patience, had often turned chaos into order. He didn't think of it as anything special. It was just who he was. He often said to himself, "Patience keeps the world from falling apart." But deep down he also knew that patience had its limits, even if he had never reached his. By mid-morning, the sun had grown hotter. The booth felt stuffy, and the smell of dust from the trucks filled the air. Harris wiped his forehead and took a sip of lukewarm tea from his flask. He thought about his family, about how his wife used to bring him lunch when she was still alive. That had been years ago, but he could still remember her walking down the road with that gentle smile, carrying a tiffin box wrapped in a kitchen towel. He missed that warmth. Now he mostly ate whatever he could afford from the canteen. As he stood by the gate watching the workers enter, his old friend, one of the machine operators, stopped by for a chat. "You're still here before all of us, huh?" the man joked. "When are you finally going to rest, old friend?" Harris chuckled softly. "Rest? I'll rest when the gate stops needing me." It was a simple reply, but there was truth behind it. He had given most of his life to this job. The guard's booth was more than his post, it was his world. Every day he stood there watching people come and go, watching the seasons change, the faces change, but the gate remained the same. It was his constant companion, but lately even he had noticed how things were changing. The management had started hiring younger supervisors who seemed more focused on efficiency than people. They spoke in numbers and targets. They looked at workers as data, not human beings. Harris didn't complain, but it made him feel a little invisible. His experience, his quiet ways, seemed old-fashioned now. As the morning hours stretched on, a group of new workers arrived. They were noisy, joking around as they entered. Harris reminded them politely to sign the entry register before going in. One of them forgot and walked off. Harris called out gently, "Please sign before you enter." The man quickly returned, apologized, and signed. Simple, small things like that mattered to him. Rules were there to keep things safe and smooth. He had seen enough chaos in his younger days to know what could happen when rules were ignored. By 11, he began feeling tired. His back ached, and he shifted his weight from one leg to the other. He leaned slightly against the booth and looked out at the factory yard. Everything looked peaceful. The trucks moving in order, workers focused on their jobs, and the sound of machines filling the air. He smiled faintly. For all his pain and worries, this place still felt like home. He didn't know it yet, but this calm was the silence before a storm that would shake his patience to the core. That storm would begin soon, not because of anything he did wrong, but because of a new face that was about to arrive. A young man with new rules, new ideas, and very little understanding of the people who had built this factory's history. But for now, Mr. Harris just took another sip of his tea and noted the time in his logbook. Noon was approaching, and the next shift of workers would soon start arriving. He looked at the gate again, straightened his cap, and whispered to himself, "One more day to get through." The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows on the ground. The old guard stood tall, steady, and silent, just as he had for years. He didn't know that before the day ended, his patience, the very thing that defined him, would be pushed to its breaking point. But for this moment, he remained what he always was, a man doing his duty, holding on to calmness in a world that rarely noticed the quiet strength it took to stay patient every single day. By the time the clock showed noon, the factory yard had become busier. The sound of machines blended with the steady rumble of trucks entering and leaving through the main gate. Mr. Harris stood under the shade near his booth, holding his logbook, noting times and signatures with his usual care. The sun was sharp, but he didn't complain. He had faced worse weather in all his years there. He was just about to take a small break when a black car pulled up near the gate. It wasn't the kind of car that usually came around. The driver jumped out quickly, opened the back door, and a young man stepped out, dressed in a crisp shirt, sunglasses, and an expression that already told everyone he was someone in charge. Mr. Harris straightened his posture out of habit and greeted him politely. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you?" The young man gave him a short nod. "New operations supervisor," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Just let me in." Harris gave a small smile. "Of course, sir. I just need to record your entry and confirm your ID for the logbook. It's routine." The man looked up now, slightly annoyed. "You don't need to confirm anything. They're expecting me inside." "I understand, sir," Harris said softly, still keeping his tone calm. "But everyone, even the manager, signs in at the gate. It's the rule." The man sighed loudly, clearly not used to being questioned. He took out his card and almost tossed it onto the desk. "Fine. Do whatever you have to do," he said impatiently. Harris didn't react. He picked up the card, wrote down the details neatly in his logbook, and handed it back with a nod. The man snatched it, pushed his sunglasses back on, and walked inside without another word. As the car drove away, Harris stood quietly for a moment, then turned the page of his logbook and continued his work. He didn't let the small incident affect him. Over the years, he had met all kinds of people, some respectful, some arrogant. His job was to treat them all the same. But later that afternoon, the young man returned, this time with a group of factory supervisors. They stopped near the gate, pointing at various things: the placement of the trucks, the time of deliveries, the speed of entry. Harris stood nearby, quietly watching as they discussed changes. He didn't speak unless spoken to. The young man, now clearly showing authority, said loudly, "This entry system is too slow. We need to make it faster. Half the time is wasted here because of outdated procedures." One of the older supervisors tried to explain, "Sir, these steps keep everything organized. Mr. Harris has been managing this gate for years without a single mistake." The young man frowned slightly. "That may be true, but experience doesn't mean efficiency. We can't run things like it's still 20 years ago." Harris didn't say anything. He just looked at the ground, quietly listening. He didn't take offense easily, but the tone bothered him a little. He wasn't angry, just uneasy. The world was changing fast and he had learned to adapt, but being spoken about as if he were part of the problem hurt more than he wanted to admit. After the supervisors left, a few workers gathered near the booth during their short break. They had overheard everything. One of them, a middle-aged man, said quietly, "That new guy doesn't know how things work here. Don't let it get to you, sir. We all know who keeps this place running." Harris smiled faintly. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm. "Everyone learns in their own time." But deep inside, something unsettled him. He had given his best years to this job, treated it like a duty more than work. And now, this new person, who hadn't even spent a full day there, was calling his ways outdated. Still, Harris told himself it was just pride talking. He believed that if he stayed patient, things would settle. Later in the afternoon, as he was checking the entry papers for a delivery truck, the young supervisor came back again. This time he walked straight to the booth. "Mr. Harris," he said sharply, glancing at the papers in his hand. "Why are these trucks still waiting outside? They should have been cleared 10 minutes ago." Harris turned toward him politely. "I was just verifying the documents, sir. There was a small mismatch in the delivery list and I needed to confirm it." The man crossed his arms. "We don't have time for this. From now on, just let them in if they have the company tag. I'll handle the paperwork later." Harris hesitated. "I understand your concern, sir, but if we don't check properly, it could cause confusion later. One wrong entry can—" The man interrupted, raising his voice. "I said I'll handle it. You just follow instructions." For the first time, Harris felt a small knot form in his chest. He had never liked being spoken to like that, but he kept his calm. "Of course, sir," he said quietly and stepped aside. The young man nodded and walked away, satisfied. That evening, after the rush hours were over, Harris sat inside the booth for a few minutes, staring at his logbook. The pages were filled with neat lines of writing, names, vehicle numbers, and times, all his years of habit written in ink. He traced his finger along one of the lines and sighed. He wondered if it still mattered, if anyone still cared about this kind of care. To him, those pages were proof of his work, his honesty, and his pride. But to others, maybe they were just slow handwriting on old paper. As the day ended, the new supervisor passed by again on his way out. Harris stood up and nodded respectfully. The man gave a short, distracted good night without looking up from his phone and walked to his car. Harris watched the car disappear down the road before locking the gate. That night, as he walked home, the streets were quiet. The wind was cool, and the city lights flickered in the distance. He walked slowly, each step heavy with thought. He wasn't angry, but there was a strange heaviness in his heart, a feeling he couldn't name. Maybe it was sadness, or maybe it was the fear that his years of loyalty no longer meant much. When he reached his small apartment, he placed his cap on the hook by the door and sat on the old wooden chair near the window. He could hear the faint sounds of traffic far away. He thought about his job, about how proud he had always been to wear that uniform. It wasn't just a job. It had given him purpose when life gave him loss. It had kept him grounded when everything else around him changed. And now, one young man's words had made him question that purpose. He tried to brush the thoughts away. "It's just one bad day," he told himself. "Tomorrow will be better." He had said that many times before, and it usually worked. He believed patience could fix almost anything, but this time the words didn't comfort him as much. He felt something new creeping into his heart, a quiet frustration he didn't want to admit. Before going to bed, he looked at his uniform neatly folded on the chair. The badge on the shirt had lost its shine long ago, but to him, it still meant pride. He whispered softly, "You've stood by me all these years. We'll face tomorrow together, too." He lay down, listening to the hum of a ceiling fan that squeaked every few turns. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't rest. He kept thinking about how quickly people judged what they didn't understand. He had spent his life keeping the factory safe, helping others, never asking for anything more than respect. Yet now, it felt like even that was too much to expect. As the night grew quieter, Mr. Harris finally closed his eyes. He didn't know that the next day would test him even more. The calmness he had always guarded so carefully would soon be pushed to its edge. But for now, he slept with one hope in his heart. That morning would bring him back the peace that seemed to be slowly slipping away. The next morning started like any other, but the sky looked dull and gray and the air carried a heaviness that matched Mr. Harris's mood. He reached the factory gate a few minutes earlier than usual. The streets were still half asleep, and the faint smell of rain lingered in the air. He unlocked the gate, swept the ground near his booth, and arranged his logbook neatly on the desk. Everything was in place, yet something inside him didn't feel right. He tried to shake it off by focusing on his work. The first few hours went smoothly. Workers arrived one by one, greeting him as always, and he replied with polite smiles. The usual rhythm returned, checking IDs, marking entries, opening and closing the gate. It gave him comfort to lose himself in that routine. Around 9 o'clock, the same black car appeared again. The new supervisor stepped out holding a clipboard and a steaming cup of coffee. His tone was sharp and brisk from the moment he spoke. "Morning," he said quickly, not waiting for a reply. "We've got a delivery rush today. I want these trucks cleared faster." "No unnecessary delays," Harris nodded. "Understood, sir. I'll keep things moving." The supervisor gave a short nod and walked inside without further conversation. Harris sighed quietly and returned to his post. He didn't like being rushed, but he understood that the man was under pressure to prove himself. He'd seen that kind of energy before. Young men trying too hard to show control, thinking speed was the same as progress. By mid-morning, the yard was crowded. Trucks lined up outside the gate, each waiting to unload or pick up materials. The air was filled with the noise of engines and impatient honking. Harris tried to keep things in order, waving drivers forward one at a time, checking documents, signing papers, and letting them through carefully. It was the kind of busy day that tested his focus. Then came a moment that would shift everything. A large truck pulled up with a new driver who looked nervous. He handed over his delivery papers, which were missing a signature from the supplier. Harris noticed it immediately. "You'll need to get this signed before I can let you in," he said calmly. The driver scratched his head. "Sir, the person who signs it isn't in today. They told me to drop the load anyway." Harris shook his head gently. "I understand, but without the signature, I can't record it properly." "It's company policy." The driver sighed, frustrated. "Please, sir, I've been on the road since dawn. I just want to finish this and go home." Before Harris could explain further, the new supervisor appeared again, walking quickly toward them. "What's the holdup now?" he asked sharply. "The papers are missing a signature, sir," Harris explained. "I just told him. The supervisor cut him off." "Let him in. We don't have time for paperwork delays today." Harris hesitated. "Sir, I understand the urgency, but if we let this pass once, others will follow." "It's a safety rule." The young man frowned, his patience thinning. "Rules are there to make things run smoother, not slower." "I said let him in." The words stung, but Harris didn't move. His sense of duty outweighed his fear of conflict. "Sir," he said quietly but firmly, "these rules have kept this place safe for years. If something goes missing, they'll ask for my log. I can't ignore the process." The supervisor's voice rose. "You're causing delays again. I told you to let the truck in." His tone was sharp enough to draw attention. Workers nearby stopped what they were doing and turned toward the gate. The driver looked uncomfortable, unsure what to do. Harris kept his voice calm, though his chest felt tight. "I'm only doing my job, sir." The supervisor took a step closer, pointing toward the truck. "Your job is to follow instructions, not to question me. You think you know better than management?" The words were loud, and a few workers gathered quietly near the fence. They could sense tension building. Harris looked around, embarrassed by the scene. He hated public arguments. "I don't mean any disrespect," he said, "but I've been doing this a long time. If we break small rules, bigger problems follow." The young man scoffed. "Maybe that's the problem. You've been doing this too long. Times change. Maybe it's time we get someone who can keep up." The comment landed like a stone in Harris's chest. He had heard harsh words before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just criticism. It was dismissal of everything he had worked for. The crowd's quiet murmurs made it worse. He could feel their eyes on him, watching him being belittled like a schoolboy. He took a slow breath, trying to stay composed. He looked at the supervisor, then at the waiting driver and finally said softly, "I'll clear the truck, sir. But please make sure the papers are fixed later." The supervisor didn't reply. He just nodded sharply, muttered something under his breath, and walked off. The truck rolled inside and Harris stood there, staring at the ground, his hands trembling slightly. He felt a wave of shame wash over him, though he didn't know why. He had done the right thing, but somehow it felt like he had lost. When the rush eased, he stepped inside his booth and sat down for a moment. His throat was dry and his head felt heavy. He looked at the gate he had guarded for so many years, the same iron bars, the same creaking hinges. But now, it felt unfamiliar. Like something had changed between him and this place. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in his own post. One of the workers, a kind man from the packaging unit, stopped by quietly. "You did the right thing, sir," he said in a low voice. "Everyone saw what happened. Don't let him get to you." Harris smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said. "I just don't like arguments. The rules are there for a reason." The man nodded and went back to work. Harris leaned back in his chair and looked at the small clock hanging on the wall. It ticked steadily, indifferent to everything that had just happened. He thought about how strange it was, how one sentence from a stranger could undo years of peace. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was something building inside him, something he didn't recognize, a quiet ache that came from being misunderstood. Later in the afternoon, the supervisor passed by again, clipboard in hand. He didn't say a word, just glanced at Harris as if nothing had happened. Harris greeted him anyway. "Good afternoon, sir." The young man barely nodded and walked on. That small act of dismissal hurt more than the earlier shouting. At least anger showed emotion. This cold indifference made Harris feel invisible. When the final delivery of the day came, Harris checked the documents twice. Everything was in order, but his mind wasn't. He was thinking about the way things used to be, when people respected age, when patience was seen as strength, not weakness. He missed those days. The factory had grown busier, faster, louder, but somewhere in that rush, the human part of work was fading away. As the sun began to lower, the yard started to clear. Harris closed the logbook, locking it inside the drawer. His handwriting looked steady, but his heart was not. He stood by the gate, watching the workers leave, laughing and chatting, heading home to their families. He used to feel a sense of pride seeing them safe at the end of each day. Today, all he felt was tired. When the supervisor finally left, driving away in his black car, Harris watched him go without any anger, just quiet sadness. He whispered under his breath, "One day you'll understand." The wind picked up as he closed the gate for the night. The hinges creaked and he felt the chill in the air. He looked at the small guard booth, his second home, and thought about how much of his life had been spent there. Years of sun, rain, laughter, and loneliness. He had always believed that patience could solve everything. But as he stood there staring into the fading light, he wondered how much longer his patience could hold. That night, when he walked home, his steps were slower than usual. The city lights blurred slightly in his eyes, but he told himself it was just the wind. Deep inside, though, he knew something had shifted. The respect he had always given and expected in return was starting to fade, and that realization hurt more than any harsh word could. He didn't know it yet, but this quiet pain was the beginning of the storm that would finally make him speak up, the day when the calmest man at the factory would reach his limit. The next day began with a pale morning sky and a light breeze that carried the smell of wet earth from the night's rain. Mr. Harris arrived at the factory as usual, but this time he didn't feel the same calmness that used to greet him at the gate. His heart was heavy with the memories of yesterday, the harsh words, the humiliation, and the uneasy silence that followed. He had spent half the night turning in bed, wondering if he was overreacting, telling himself to stay patient. But something deep inside him had cracked, and though he didn't admit it aloud, he could feel the difference. Still, he carried on with his duty. He unlocked the gate, swept the small patch of ground near his booth, and opened his logbook with a sigh. The same neat handwriting stared back at him, line after line, date after date, a lifetime of discipline. He ran his fingers across the paper for a moment, then picked up his pen and began his shift like always. By mid-morning, the factory was in full motion. Machines hummed, trucks came and went, and workers hurried past carrying boxes, tools, and chatter. The young supervisor was back again, giving orders with his usual sharp tone. He walked around with his clipboard, moving quickly, checking times, pointing at things, and reminding everyone to work faster. Harris watched him quietly, not with anger but with a weary kind of understanding. He knew that some lessons in life could only be learned the hard way. But things began to heat up around noon. A group of delivery trucks had arrived almost at the same time, forming a line that stretched beyond the gate. The drivers were restless, honking and shouting to get in. Harris tried to manage them calmly, asking them to wait their turn. He checked documents one by one, making sure every entry matched the delivery list. It was slow, yes, but it was the right way, the safe way. Then, as if the day hadn't tested him enough, the young supervisor appeared again, his face tense. "Why is there a jam at the gate?" he demanded. "We can't waste time like this," Harris explained, keeping his tone even. "The documents are being checked, sir. One of the trucks has mismatched paperwork. I'm verifying before allowing it through." The supervisor frowned. "We don't have time for this nonsense again." "You're holding up production." Harris tried to remain calm. "It's not nonsense, sir. It's part of the process. If something goes wrong, we'll be the ones answering for it." But the young man wasn't listening. He walked closer, his voice rising so everyone nearby could hear. "You and your process are outdated. We need to move faster. This isn't the army. It's a factory." The word stung like a slap. Harris stood still, gripping his pen tightly. He wasn't angry yet, but the pressure inside him grew heavier with every breath. The workers nearby had stopped to look. Some of them exchanged glances, sensing what might come next. "Sir," Harris said quietly, trying to keep control. "I've been doing this for many years. We've had no accidents, no thefts, no losses under my watch. If we skip checks, that could change." The supervisor's tone turned mocking. "So now you're teaching me how to do my job? Maybe if you'd done yours faster, I wouldn't have to." The words echoed in the air. For the first time in years, Harris felt his patience slipping away. His jaw tightened and his hands trembled slightly. He had swallowed insults before, endured long hours, sleepless nights, and aching joints. But this felt different. It wasn't just disrespect, it was disregard for everything he had stood for. He took a step forward, his eyes steady. "Sir," he said slowly, "you may not like how I work, but I've kept this place safe since before you even joined. I'm not asking for thanks, but I do deserve a little respect." The young man looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected the quiet guard to speak back. The air around them grew tense. A few workers had gathered near the fence, watching silently. The driver in the truck sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The supervisor crossed his arms. "Respect is earned, old man. And right now, you're just slowing everyone down." That was the moment the dam broke. Harris's voice, usually soft and steady, grew louder, filled with emotion. "Earned?" he repeated. "I've stood at this gate in storms, in heat, in nights when no one else showed up. I've missed family dinners, weddings, and birthdays for this job. You think I haven't earned it?" His words came from somewhere deep inside. The years of service, the silent sacrifices, the endless patience that everyone took for granted. The workers stood still, some with their mouths slightly open, watching a man they had only ever seen quiet now, speaking with a strength that surprised them. The supervisor opened his mouth to reply, but Harris raised his hand, stopping him. "You see numbers, deadlines, and reports," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I see faces. I see people who trust me to keep them safe when they walk through this gate. You may not understand that now, but one day you will." There was silence after that. The only sound came from a passing truck rumbling down the road. The young man stood frozen, his expression softening for the first time. He didn't know what to say. Harris took a deep breath and turned toward his small booth. He picked up his cap and placed it carefully on the desk. His hand lingered there for a second before he looked up again. "I'm not leaving because I'm angry," he said softly. "I'm leaving because sometimes silence teaches less than truth." Then he walked to the bench near the gate and sat down, his shoulders heavy but his eyes calm. The workers stood quietly, not sure what to do. Even the supervisor stayed silent, staring at the man who had just reminded everyone what dignity really meant. After a few minutes, the factory manager came out, alerted by the whispers that had spread through the yard. He looked at Harris, then at the uneasy supervisor, and asked what had happened. Before anyone could speak, one of the workers stepped forward and said, "Sir, he wasn't wrong. He just wanted things done right." The manager listened, then turned to Harris. "You've been with us a long time," he said gently. "I'll handle this. Please take a break." Harris nodded, stood up slowly, and gave a small salute out of habit. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "I just need a moment." The rest of the day moved slower. The young supervisor didn't raise his voice again. The workers, out of respect, worked quietly. The gate stood open, but everyone who passed through it glanced at the bench where Harris had sat earlier, as if something sacred had happened there. The old guard had not shouted or cursed, but his words had left a mark deeper than anger ever could. As evening came, Harris returned to his post. He didn't speak much. He simply resumed his duties, noting entries in his logbook. When the shift ended, he closed the gate as he always did, locking it with steady hands. The young supervisor approached him hesitantly. "I didn't mean to insult you earlier," he said quietly. "I just wanted things to go faster." Harris looked at him for a long moment and then smiled faintly. "You'll learn," he said kindly. "Speed is good, but respect is better. Without that, nothing lasts." The young man nodded, humbled. Harris picked up his bag and walked toward the road. The sun had already dipped low, painting the sky in soft orange and gold. He felt tired but lighter, as if a burden had lifted from his heart. He hadn't lost his patience. He had simply finally spoken what needed to be said. That night, as he reached home and hung his cap on the same hook, he looked at it with quiet pride. He knew tomorrow he'd return to the gate as usual. But now everyone at the factory would see him differently, not just as the quiet old guard, but as the man who finally reminded them that patience doesn't mean silence, and respect should never depend on age or rank. The morning after the heated argument felt strangely quiet. When Mr. Harris arrived at the factory, the air around the gate seemed different. The workers greeted him with a quiet respect, their voices softer, their smiles more genuine. Even the young supervisor, who usually came rushing in with orders and complaints, nodded politely before walking past. For the first time in weeks, Harris felt seen. He sat inside his small booth, flipping through his logbook, pretending to read. But his thoughts drifted far away, to his younger days when life felt simpler, when his uniform wasn't just fabric but a symbol of honor and discipline. He remembered his first day at this factory years ago, how he had stood tall, proud to have a job that gave him purpose. Now, as he looked at his wrinkled hands resting on the desk, he wondered if that same pride had faded somewhere along the way. Just then, the factory manager appeared at the gate. He was a calm man with kind eyes, someone who didn't speak often but observed everything. "Morning, Harris," he said warmly. "Can we talk for a bit?" "Of course, sir," Harris replied, standing up straight out of habit. They walked to a bench under the old neem tree beside the booth. The shade felt comforting. The manager sat down first. "I heard what happened yesterday," he said gently. "You've been here longer than most people working in that building. I know your heart's always been in the right place." Harris didn't say much. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. The manager continued. "The young man, he's still learning. He made mistakes, but your words, they hit him hard. Maybe that's what he needed to hear." Harris sighed. "I didn't mean to embarrass him. I just couldn't stay silent anymore." "I understand," the manager said. "You've earned your peace, Harris. Maybe it's time we think about what's next for you. You've given enough years here. How would you feel about retiring soon with full honor and benefits?" For a moment, Harris didn't move. Retirement. The word felt both heavy and freeing. He had known it was coming someday. But now that it was here, it stirred something inside him, a mix of pride, fear, and sadness. "I suppose it's about time," he said quietly. "But I'll miss this place." The manager smiled softly. "And this place will miss you. But don't worry. We'll make sure your last week here is special." When the manager left, Harris sat there for a while, watching the workers move in and out of the gate. The world didn't stop for anyone, he thought. It never had. But at least he could leave knowing he'd done his job with honesty. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. The young supervisor, who had argued with him, walked up to the booth holding 2 cups of tea. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Harris looked up, surprised, but nodded. The young man handed him a cup and sat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of machines hummed faintly in the distance. "I wanted to say thank you," the young man said finally, "for what you said yesterday. I didn't like hearing it, but you were right. I was being impatient and arrogant." Harris smiled slightly. "That's part of learning, son. I was like that once, too. Thought I knew everything. The supervisor chuckled. I doubt that. Oh, you'd be surprised, Harris replied, sipping his tea. Life has a funny way of humbling us. They both laughed softly. The tension that had built between them had quietly dissolved. For the first time, they talked, not as guard and supervisor, but as two men, generations apart, connected by respect. Over the next few days, things at the factory changed in small but meaningful ways. The young supervisor started checking on the workers personally, asking for their input, treating them more kindly. The atmosphere grew lighter, less tense. People started noticing it, and many whispered that it was because of the guard at the gate who had spoken his truth. One evening, near the end of his last week, the factory arranged a small farewell for Harris. It wasn't grand, but it was sincere. A table was set up near the gate with some snacks and tea. The manager gave a short speech thanking him for his years of loyalty and service. The young supervisor also spoke, admitting in front of everyone that Harris had taught him more in one conversation than any training could. When it was Harris's turn, he stood up slowly, holding a cup of tea in his hand. His voice trembled a little, not from weakness but from emotion. I never thought I'd stand here like this, he began. When I started this job, I just wanted to do my duty. I didn't know that one day this place and the people in it would feel like family. He paused, looking around at the familiar faces, some smiling, some teary-eyed. I've seen so many changes. Machines came, people left, buildings grew taller. But one thing never changed, the importance of respect. No matter who you are or what you do, if you give respect, you'll always earn it back. The crowd clapped softly, some wiping their eyes. Harris smiled, humbled by their warmth. He looked at the young supervisor and nodded, and the man nodded back with a grateful smile. After the farewell, Harris packed up his small belongings, a few pens, his old logbook, and a worn-out cap. As he locked the booth one last time, his hand lingered on the door handle. He could still hear the faint echo of his younger self greeting workers, giving directions, laughing with the truck drivers. Those memories stayed with him like the fading scent of rain on dry soil. Before leaving, he took one last look at the gate. The sun was setting behind the factory, casting a golden glow across the walls. He stood there quietly, then whispered under his breath, "Thank you." As he walked down the road toward home, his steps were slow but steady. He passed by the small tea stall where he often stopped after his shift. The stall owner smiled and said, "Same tea as always, Mr. Harris?" Harris chuckled. "Yes, but make it a little stronger today." He sat on the wooden bench watching the traffic move by, and for the first time in years, he didn't have to think about time cards or log entries. The world seemed to move at its own pace, and he was finally free to just watch. As the days went on, he adjusted to a quieter life. He spent mornings tending to his small garden, afternoons walking to the park, and evenings talking to old neighbors who now had plenty of time too. But sometimes when the breeze carried the distant sound of factory horns, he would smile and think of the gate, the place that had taught him patience, dignity, and the quiet power of doing things right. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the factory. Inside was a small note and a framed photograph. It was of him standing at the gate on his last day, smiling, surrounded by the workers. The note said, "For the man who guarded more than just a gate. You guarded our trust." Harris held the frame for a long time, tears welling in his eyes. He placed it on his table where the morning sunlight would fall on it every day. He didn't need medals or big rewards. That photograph was enough. It told the story of a man who had given his best even when no one was watching. As the sun dipped beyond the rooftops, he stepped outside, feeling the cool evening wind. Somewhere a distant horn blew, and for a brief moment he imagined himself back at the gate, standing tall, calm, and proud. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Some doors close, but the duty stays in your heart forever." And with that, Mr. Harris turned back toward his home, his heart peaceful, his spirit strong, and his life quietly full of meaning.